I'll just go over very quickly the list of 6 things that could have been done. Number 1, the Commission could have simply gathered evidence of all possible allegations and accusations leveled by each side against the other, simply taking testimony. This group was superbly equipped to do that when it came to the Palestinian side. Why? Because people who take testimony and gather testimony have to have the trust of those who they're gathering testimony from. And there were 4 members of the Commission. One of them was from Pakistan, a judge. Pakistan, of course, doesn't have diplomatic relations with Israel, doesn't recognize Israel's right to exist. And the woman from Pakistan said, this is how she started out her quest. She said that, quote, it would be cruel not to give credence to the Palestinian testimony. In other words, she started out with a predisposition to accepting the Palestinian testimony. That makes her superbly qualified to be a gatherer of testimony, surely not superbly qualified to be an evaluator of its credibility, when she started out by saying it would be cruel to conclude that anything any of them said was not credible. The second person was, so before we get to the people on the Commission, so that's one thing they could have done, gather testimony. By the way, had they done that, this would have been a very good report. Because let me tell you, as somebody who generally supports Israel, there are some very devastating critiques of Israel here, if you believe the testimony of those who gave testimony against Israel. And it would have been very useful to simply provide the testimony and say to Israel, now respond. Tell us, is this true? Give us information by which we can assess the credibility. The same thing would have been true if testimony were gathered by victims of Sderot, testimony were gathered by victims in Israel, and then it would have been presented to Hamas and asked Hamas to evaluate the testimony. That would have been a very useful function. I think Israel has an obligation to respond. There are some very damning critiques. One particularly about a neighborhood in which civilians live, in which the testimony says, if believed and if true, that Israel bombed civilian areas when there was no need to and when there was no counterfire coming from those areas. If that allegation is true, it's very serious. Israel bombed a mosque in which 150 people were praying, 15 people were killed. If that is true, that's a serious charge. And if there's no answer to it in terms of this was a place where military action was going on or Israel made a mistake. I would say there are about 10 serious charges against Israel that warrant a response. And that's why I urged Prime Minister Netanyahu to appoint a high-level commission. I would hope it would either have President Aaron Barak of the Supreme Court or former President Shamgar of the Supreme Court with great military experience to look into these allegations and respond. Had the Goldstone Commission limited itself to gathering testimony, it would have been a superb report. But then it went to stage 2. It assessed the credibility of the testimony and found virtually everything that the Palestinian witnesses said to be credible, even though they know that Hamas would kill anybody who gave testimony, and they basically admitted that was contrary to the Hamas position, and even though the hearings were televised, so that Hamas could sit and watch all of the witnesses give the testimony and clearly sit there with a gun over their shoulder pointing at the TV. But nonetheless, they found it all absolutely credible. They also found credible dissidents within Israel who testified against the Israeli position. But they found virtually incredible every statement made by an Israeli government official or by other Israeli witnesses. So the second phase of the report, an assessment of credibility, this group was utterly disqualified. In fact, Judge Goldstone himself said that if this had been a judicial inquiry, clearly the woman who, Professor Christine Chinkin, who had before being picked to serve on this commission, had said Israel had committed war crimes in Gaza. She had already come to that conclusion. He acknowledged that she would be disqualified and recused from serving on any commission that had any kind of a judicial or quasi-judicial role. He also said, by the way, that if this had been a court of law, nothing that they found would be worth anything, and that they didn't have any, quote, real evidence of any crimes or war crimes. That's what he says when being interviewed by the Forward, a Jewish newspaper. That surely is not what the report says. The report is filled with judicial conclusions, conclusions about assessment of testimony, and credibility. So who else was on the commission? How valid were their assessments of credibility? Well, I mentioned Christine Jenkins. She had already said it was a war crime. And Goldstone said, quote, if this were a court of law, there would have been nothing proved. There's no actual evidence. Hina Jelani, the Pakistani, it would be cruel not to give credence to Palestinian testimony. And now let's go to Colonel Desmond Travers, an officer in Ireland. You all know Ireland today probably is the most stridently anti-Israel country in all of Europe. I'm on Irish radio and television all the time trying to present some balance, but Irish radio and television is completely one-sidedly biased against Israel. And this man had the incredible gall to say that there's no possible way in which, here I'll read it to you, he said, there's no evidence that mosques were used to store munitions. Those charges reflect Western perceptions in some quarters that Islam is a violent religion. If I were a Hamas operative, the last place I'd store munitions would be in a mosque. The only problem is there are hundreds of photographs, videos, eyewitness testimonies, admissions by Hamas operatives that the mosque is the favorite place to store munitions. The basement of the mosque, underneath the area where the imam, when you have a man, this is a military man, who says he can't believe that they would ever store ammunition in a mosque. In the Saladin Mosque, the Israelis broke in and found all this ammunition. Of course, the Goldstone Commission said, we didn't study that mosque. They picked only the mosque in which they claim there had been no use of human shielding or no use of mosques to hide guns or material. So we have 4 members of the commission, 3 of whom come in with a strong bias, and the 4th one is picked precisely to give a certification of kosher to the report. His name was Goldstone. The UN regretted that. They would much prefer if his name was Goldstein or Goldberg, but they had to settle for Goldstone. They announced over and over again that he was Jewish. When's the last time? I don't remember them announcing that Hina Jelani was Muslim, but they announced over and over again that Goldstone was Jewish. Now, they didn't put Irwin Cotler on the commission. They didn't pick other distinguished jurists who might actually look critically into some of these assessments. Instead, they picked an ambitious, international judge who has ambitions within the international community and who simply didn't have the courage to stand up to what he had to know were false conclusions and false reports. And I want to just analyze, okay, before I do that, let me finish the other 4 things that could have been done and were done. So the next thing they did do is they then gathered evidence of what the intentions were. They know that Hamas fighters were in civilian areas, but they then gathered evidence trying to prove that although they were in civilian areas, it was not their intent to hide within civilian areas. Just because some of them were wearing civilian uniforms, they were not intentionally using human shields. But as far as Israel is concerned, they found evidence of intent and a deliberate effort to kill civilians. Now, this is the core of the report, and I'm going to get to that in a minute and spend the rest of my time on that. But the last 2 things they do is come to legal conclusions, and of the 4, really 2 were not qualified to come to any legal conclusions. And the 6th thing is to do an overall assessment of the political situation, which they do in the report. Gaza, the West Bank wasn't even part of their mandate, and clearly they have the narrative all wrong. For example, there's no real discussion of the fact that the Palestinians could have had a state on all of Gaza, 97% of the West Bank, capital of Jerusalem, $35 billion reparation package, symbolic return of some refugees, and a great deal more if they accepted the Camp David and Tava offers by President Clinton and Abe Barak. Virtually no mention of that. The narrative is completely skewed.